India's GDP growth numbers just came out and man, things look bad. The fast-moving consumer goods sector, which used to be the star boy of the country, is now facing a severe slowdown. The chief managing director of Nestle India revealed something shocking. He said that the FMCG sector, which used to grow at 12 to 15% just a few quarters ago, is now growing at just 1.5 to 2%. And this is huge because private consumption contributes to about 62% of our country's GDP growth. What that translates to is that nearly half of the country's growth comes from you and I spending money on our everyday essentials. The things we use every single day like clothes, cars, detergents, snacks, and many more. But it turns out that the laws being written today are keeping you and me poor and unable to spend our own money. Now, this video is divided into two parts. The first one that breaks down the GDP and the economic data that has come out recently and tells you how bad the situation is. And the second part talks about what the government is doing to make it worse. To fix it. And if you think high taxes are good for a country like India, then give me just 15 minutes of your time and I'll ensure you understand that they do more harm than good. And I promise you that I'll do this purely with the help of data and logic. No bias, no bullshit. This October, a shocking piece of data was released that literally every Indian across the globe needs to care about. And that was our food inflation reached a high of 11%. Food inflation in particular is the absolute worst. Over the past 4 years, it had averaged at 6%. However, now it doubled to 11%. What that means is Indians now have to spend way more on getting 3 meals a day that they hardly have anything left to spend on other stuff. As a result, our pockets started hurting and we weren't able to spend money. And private consumption, which makes up 62% of our GDP, took a backseat. The RBI projected our GDP to grow at 7%. Instead, it only grew at 5.4%, the slowest over the past 7 quarters. A great way to see the economy's situation is to simply examine the auto sector because it is highly synchronized with the economy's boom and bust cycles. Since virtually every single industry in the country and consumers like you and I depend severely on the auto sector, we can simply take a look at that sector to understand how well or how poorly the economy is doing. Take a look at this article by the Times of India. It mentions how the average discounts in the auto sector grew almost 50% from 14,500 to 21,700 rupees. And these discounts are at the highest level they've been over the past 5 years. Why? Because all of these cars are just sitting at the dealerships. Indians do not have any money left to buy cars. Auto dealers are seeing an all-time high inventory of nearly 8 lakh units, which is worth 79,000 crores because of weak demand. And keep in mind, the auto sector tells you about what's going on in the economy. The situation is just as bad for the other industries as well. They aren't able to sell their stuff and as a result, revenues are dropping. They aren't able to hire more people or pay better wages. Look at this heartbreaking piece of data.
Indian companies are doing really well, but the workers are not getting their fair share. Just look at these numbers. Corporate profits quadrupled from 2019 to 2023. Basically, profits have increased by 300%. Now look at the wages. In engineering and manufacturing fields, wages increased by 0.8%. In the financial sector by 2.8%. In logistics by 4.2%. And in consumer goods by 5.4%. I know these numbers look bad, but they look even worse if you account for inflation.
India's chief economic advisor V. Anantha Nageswaran was quoted saying this to the First Post. In simple words, Nageswaran sir was trying to say this, that corporates were able to anticipate that things are about to get messed up. So they thought, if we are making money now, let's use that money to repay our debts, because if tomorrow our revenues start declining, we might be in even more trouble. This is a common thing that happens when someone prepares for a slowdown. They take lesser risk and reinvest lesser money. And obviously, even though the corporates quadrupled their profits over the past 4 years, they were right in anticipating a slowdown. And when that happens, the unemployment data starts looking like a horror movie. From 7% in November 2021 to almost 8.7% in October 2024. In fact, in June 2024, we recorded the all-time high unemployment of 9.2% over the past 3 years. Forget reducing unemployment by hiring new people. Companies are now firing. In 2024, in the IT sector alone, nearly 1.3 lakh people lost their jobs due to layoffs. And since Indians aren't making the same kind of money that they used to, they are now borrowing more and more money. Banks and NBFCs in India also reported that over the past 7 months, the gold loans grew by almost 50% in value. That is unprecedented. Now, many people in the world might see credit growth as a good thing, but let me remind you that gold in India is looked at as auspicious. Indians have a belief system where they perceive gold as something that brings luck and wealth in their family, and that's why they sell or pledge it only as a last resort. Even in my own family, every time I've purchased physical gold, my parents have told me, pray that you never have to sell it, because selling or pledging your gold is a sign of distress for us. So up until this point, there is high inflation, hardly any growth for companies, and a shortage of jobs. The point being, we are seeing both stagnation and inflation, meaning a deadly combination that the economists call stagflation. Now we come to part 2 of the video. What is the government doing? Now, before we get into that, if you've learned something new up until this point, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, because A, it keeps us motivated, and B, it keeps the algorithm happy. To understand what the government is doing, let's consider the example of Karan. He works a 9-to-5 job at one of India's biggest automobile manufacturers. He's a senior vice president at his company and he makes great money, about 2 lakh rupees a month, which puts him in a higher tax bracket where he effectively pays 24% of his paycheck in the form of income tax. He has about 76% of his income left over, and when he goes out to spend it, he shells out an additional 5 to 28% in the form of indirect taxes, that is GST. The average rate for GST for most people in India is 15%. So every time Karan earns 1 rupee, he's left with just 76 paise after income taxes, and he's only able to buy goods worth 64 paise after accounting for GST. Now, that's not all. Karan bought a car from his own company because he gets a 5% employee discount. However, the car that Karan bought was an SUV because he has a large family. But the Indian government looks at SUVs as sin items. And for that reason, they tax the SUV at 28 plus 22%, which means almost 50% of the car's cost is paid in the form of taxes. And that's just the ex-showroom price. Karan will also have to spend money on road tax, registration, and obviously fuel. Fuel in India also has a 55% tax component that pinches consumers like Karan. Now obviously Karan isn't irresponsible, so he doesn't spend all of his money. He invests some of it in stocks and mutual funds. One of his biggest stock holdings is his own company where he works, because he believes that I work here, I believe in this company, so why not be an investor? And Karan's conviction is absolutely correct. The company has been consistently posting better revenue numbers every single year. And obviously the company's revenues have already attracted GST, which was paid by the company's customers. Now this year the company posted a bumper profit, and this profit was taxed at a whopping 25% corporate profits tax. And when this after-tax profit was distributed to shareholders like Karan in the form of dividend, guess what happened? The government treats dividends as ordinary income. So for Karan, since he falls in the 30% tax bracket, he pays an additional 30% of that dividend to the government. Now 30% is a lot, so Karan decides to escape the dividend and just sell his shares for a profit. But he's not safe there either, because every time you sell a stock and make a profit, you pay anywhere between 12.5% to 20% to the government in the form of capital gains tax. A single economic activity is happening here. The company is selling cars to its consumers, but despite that, taxation is occurring at 5 different levels. While the country is struggling with lower growth, higher unemployment, and layoffs, do you see the levels of exploitation that taxation brings upon the average citizen of the country? And this impacts us in more ways than you can think. Follow along the same example of Karan's company that sells cars. The government charges GST on the price of the car, which obviously inflates the final price of the car and discourages a consumer from buying it.
मारो हमको जिंदा मत छोड़ो सालो।
This leads to potentially lower revenues for the company and obviously lower profits. And these profits are additionally taxed at 25%. So both these layers of taxation lead to lower profits that could be reinvested in the company's growth and pay better wages to employees like Karan. Karan, who's already getting a suboptimal wage due to high levels of taxation at the company level, is also forced to pay income tax to the government, which reduces his in-hand earnings even more. This reduces the amount of money that he could spend on various goods and services, which in turn reduces the revenues for companies who sell these goods and services. And this way, we are trapped in a cycle of slower and slower growth as we see higher and higher taxation. Because these taxes impact both reinvestment and consumption. A lose-lose situation. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, aren't taxes good? They are used to make investments in the country. But except for roads and public transport, are any of these investments paying off? The citizens of our country are blind to a very basic question. Is it the government's business to be in business? And before you call me biased, hear me out. I'll prove it with the help of data and logic. Let's take a look at the telecom sector in India, which has always been very difficult to enter or even operate in. You need several licenses and clearances and also huge capital to bid for the rights to be able to sell cellular services in this country. For example, in 2024, when the government opened up the auction for the 5G waves, the base price for this auction was set at 96,000 crore rupees. The telecom companies in India deposited anywhere between 300 to 3,000 crores to participate in this auction. The point being, this sector was so capital intensive and government regulated that it was nearly impossible to enter it and start a new business unless you have billions of dollars. And B, if you still manage this somehow, you would still very likely fail because of how expensive it is. Mainly because the government charges something called AGR dues here, which is 12 to 16% of any telecom company's revenues that have to be paid to the government directly over and above every single tax that we just discussed. And exactly because of this, we have seen 16 telecom operators either shut down and go bankrupt or merge with larger players. We are now at a situation where just 3 telecom operators exist in India and there is a monopoly-like situation. And obviously, in such an environment, there was a government-owned telecom operator called BSNL. Now get this, BSNL hasn't posted a profit over the past 12 years. On 7th June last year, the government approved a whopping 89,000 crore rupees to revive BSNL. That is almost $10 billion to revive a failed telecommunications operator. The whole idea that the government had behind taking money from you and me and the private sector in the form of taxes to revive BSNL was to increase the competition in the telecom sector. Because there is just 3 companies left, and also to ensure that mobile data reaches every single remote corner of India. Now, based on this data, you tell me with the help of logic which one of the following 2 solutions meets the government's objectives. Number 1, the government increases competition by spending $10 billion of the taxpayers' money to revive BSNL in a sector that the government itself made nearly impossible to enter, let alone make a profit. Or number 2, the government increases competition in the telecom sector by deregulating it, reducing the licensing requirements and the upfront costs involved such that more competitors find it viable to enter this sector and foster healthy growth. And of course, getting rid of the AGR dues mechanism which drove so many mobile companies into bankruptcy. And these aren't any new solutions. Our government is already aware of them. Our finance minister has repeated time and again, minimum government, maximum governance. Tell me, from the 2 solutions that I just mentioned, which one was actually minimum government and which one was implemented in the country? It's not too late. The government can still get its act together and reduce the tax burden on you and me. How? By reducing taxes on you and me and by cutting down on spends where the government is directly involved in doing business, such as our BSNL example. We could actually let the economy chart its own course and grow at a sustainable rate provided we lower our taxes, reduce the burden on businesses by increasing the ease of doing business and keeping government spending restricted only to the essential stuff such as infrastructure. However, this only happens when you and I talk about it and raise our voices. If you learned something new today, share this ahead and consider subscribing.